time for another experimental video. This time I have been sewing little bags and I had an idea for a little bag to sew for dolls. So that's the sewing experiment part of this video. And the editing experiment of this video is going to be
adding a voiceover.
So we'll see how that goes.
Okay, here are the fabric pieces that I used in the bag. 2 pieces the same size. And here are the mesh window screen pieces, also the same size. And the strip of ribbon I'm using for the handles. And I will tell you, I did not measure anything here. Okay, start by assembling each side by sewing the long edge of the fabric to the long edge of the window screen. About a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I pretty rough on that too. As long as you can keep things consistent, it will work out. I will also add right now that I didn't record this video in real time without editing it away to be faster or editing anything out. So there might be some breaks in the action, but overall you'll be able to see what a quick project this is. Sewing the other side here. And I didn't realize until watching this video how fiddly I get about trimming threads. So there's going to be a lot of times where I trim it and then go back and trim it again and then trim it again, and that surprised me. See? Alright, now I'm going to edge stitch the fabric where it meets the window screen mesh. And I edge stitch by aligning the edge I'm stitching near with the inside of the straight stitch presser foot that I use. I know a lot of people tend to use the zigzag foot on their sewing machines, but I switched to the straight stitch foot a while ago, and that is what I'm used to. And it really does help with making very narrow precise edge stitching. So you're not going to get me to leave my precious beloved straight stitch foot in the future. You can tell that I'm trying to fill in the time when I'm not telling you what I'm doing and I see more threads to snip. Alright, now I'm going to sew one short edge of the front and back together, and I put a pin through the stitching so I can have that exactly aligned. And my shoulder is in the way now, but you will be able to see overall what I'm doing. Another roughly 1/4 inch seam. And I'm very careful when I sew near pins, so I don't usually sew directly onto them. Alright, now cut an angle away from the top of the seam allowance like you just saw me do, because that reduces the bulk. And now we're going to fold this over, and that will just help make that a little less bulky when you sew that hem that way. I am checking to make sure that things are even enough. Now I'm going to sew this top over and sew the hem. Again, aligning it with the inside of the straight stitch presser foot. Now I could have sewn the hems separately on each piece without sewing them together first, but I like doing it this way. Even though I admit I've never done this project before, I like the idea of doing it this way because that means I can just sew one longer hem instead of 2 short hems. It made sense to me, and I probably will do it this way again in the future because I probably will make more of these. Alright, now it is time to sew on the straps. First thing I'm going to do is cut this completely random length of ribbon. Like I said, I have no idea how long this was. It was already this length when I got it out of my trim stash. Cut that in half, and then, well, I didn't exactly cut it in the middle, so I'm going to even up the other edge so they are both the same length. Okay, and now you'll see my chaos in action. First, I aligned it roughly where I thought would be a good place for the straps to go. Pinned it this side. Made sure it was straight and not twisted when I pushed it over to place it on the other side. And I'm going to pin that in place just to hold it. See, it took me a while to get there, but I did pin it. Alright, now I'm going to fold that whole piece in half, matching the raw edge with the raw edge and the seam allowance I just sewed. And then shift one piece of ribbon to line up with the other one. So again, without measuring anything, it is going to make it nice and symmetrically placed. Alright, so now it's time to sew. Again, with my straight stitch foot, I am able to edge stitch along this very narrow ribbon. I'm not sure how easily that can be done with a zigzag foot, so feel free to try sewing just down the center of the ribbon, or maybe even zigzagging over it with your zigzag. They're about the same width as the ribbon. And I sew up to the edge, the hem at the top, and then I turn it and make one stitch that's just a little bit longer than the width of the ribbon, so I fiddle with it a little and then turn and stitch down the other side. And then you'll see me get fiddly about trimming threads again. I do the thing I sometimes do where I cut the threads on top and then I gently pull them to the back, because sometimes there will be little tiny bits of the cut thread that stick out, and if you're careful you can pull those to the back where they will be hidden. Alright, it was a little weird sewing with the pin head the direction it was on the first side, so I turned that around for this side, and everything else I'm doing is exactly the same, edge stitching up to the top hem of the bag. I'm getting a little paranoid that I didn't actually make the strap straight, so I checked that real quick. Alright, to the top, turn one fiddly stitch, turn. Always turn things with the needle in the project. That will hold it in place. Alright, now time to get fiddly about cutting the thread again. And then time to do this on the other side. Wait, more thread, more thread. Okay, now time to do it on the other side. So I folded it insides together, and I am just going to use the position of the ribbon on the previous side to mark where the ribbon should go on this side. You could measure this. It might be more precise if you measured it, but yeah, I didn't measure it. It later occurred to me that I probably could have put pins in the top to show where the ribbon was when it met the top hem of the bag on the other side, but I don't think that's really a problem since you're never going to see both sides directly at once. So I just eyeballed things once it came to actually sewing the ribbon up straight to the top of the bag. So now they are pinned in place. And I learned my lesson on the first side. I'm going to actually put a different pin in with the head pointing the opposite direction so it won't be in the way when I start sewing. It looks about roughly this, right place. Other pin in the other side. Eventually. And folding it over again just to make sure things line up. And they do. Now time to stitch again. If you were doing this the very Mattel way, you could definitely do it with one stitch down the center of each ribbon. Another thing you could do if you were doing it Mattel way is also not even do a side seam, just do long strips and fold them in half. Now, I don't mean that completely derogatorily when I say the Mattel way. Mattel used to make fairly detailed stuff for dolls, and that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of. Sometimes their construction would be really novel because of the way they were simplifying things, but that was, you know, well into the 90s when people now would say the quality was better than it is now, so nothing to be ashamed of if you choose to do things that way yourself when you're sewing your own doll stuff. Alright. Last strap to sew. And again, apologies that my shoulder and braid are blocking so much, but I think you get the idea what I'm doing. Like I said, I didn't realize how much I fiddled with thread tails until I watched this particular video. Okay, now what's left is to sew those last two sides together. So fold it, close right sides together, and I put a pin in the top here, even though I didn't when I sewed the other side, because the other side, any irregularities, would have been hidden when it was folded over and seamed, and on this side, this is it, the seams are what you have, so it takes a little more effort to get them lined up, but it will look better in the end. And another pin where the seam between the mesh and the fabric are, just to keep those aligned nicely. Again, carefully sewing past the pins. If you go slow enough, then you can make sure you don't hit the pin. And turning about a 1/4 inch from the bottom, sewing over to the other side, realizing that, oops, when I sewed that seam on the other side, I should have stopped it about 1/2 inch from the bottom, and then sewing up that just to reinforce it, because technically you should trim that corner to make it easier to turn right side out, although I actually don't think I did, but I should have. Okay, trim the edge of the top of the seam away at an angle. Again, this just keeps the seam, more thread. This will just keep the seam allowance from sticking up past the edge. And then I was about to trim that corner and I noticed, oh, this bottom seam is not straight. So I re-sewed that. And then sewing up the seam intersects, because there's a possibility that when I trimmed the corner to make it less bulky so it could be turned right side up more easily, it's possible I could have clipped through the stitching and then the whole thing would have come unstitched, so I just needed to make sure that was reinforced. Alright. Now it is finished. It's time to turn it right side out. And then to get those corners pushed out properly, I got the flathead screwdriver that actually was included with my serger. And then I very gently persuade the fabric to make a nice, relatively sharp corner. No shoving or poking. That's how you end up with even a large flathead screwdriver like this sticking out through your corner. You persuade it gently, and there we go.
So the sewing part of this experiment turned out to be very successful, I'd say. I mean, it's not perfect, it's a little uneven, but when it's on a doll you can't really tell. And I think this could be done with, like, you don't need this window screen mesh, it could be done with 2 different fabrics, or maybe a solid fabric and maybe lace, or even just do the whole thing in one fabric. But I think you get the idea of how to add these straps to the bag, and it's pretty easy, I think. So my dolls, I think I've been saying for a while I want to sew more bags for them, so maybe you can sew more for your dolls too. Alright, thanks for watching.